Silence is misunderstood by most people because they confuse it with weakness, avoidance, or fear. But silence is none of those things when it is chosen consciously, because silence is not the absence of words, it is the presence of control. And the reason silence feels uncomfortable is because it removes the last defense most people rely on to protect their ego, which is the ability to explain themselves, justify their behavior, soften perception, and negotiate how others see them. And when that ability is removed voluntarily, the mind panics, because the ego survives through reaction, recognition, and response, and silence denies all three at once. And this is why silence has always been associated with authority, power, and dominance across history, not because it intimidates loudly, but because it creates pressure quietly. And the silent samurai understood this long before psychology named it, because a warrior who speaks too much reveals intention, insecurity, and emotional instability, while a warrior who observes silently, gathers information, maintains leverage, and remains unpredictable. And unpredictability is power, because people cannot control what they cannot read. And when you speak unnecessarily, you reduce mystery. And when mystery disappears, leverage disappears with it. Which is why people who talk constantly are easy to manipulate, easy to provoke, and easy to control, because they give away their emotional state freely, while silence keeps emotional access locked. And most people fear silence because silence forces them to sit with their own thoughts, their own insecurity, and their own unresolved tension. And when you remain silent in a moment where reaction is expected, you disrupt the social script, and disruption creates discomfort, and discomfort exposes weakness, because confident people are comfortable with silence, while insecure people rush to fill it. And this is not arrogance, it is regulation, because regulated minds do not need to perform, they do not need to over-explain, and they do not need to seek approval through noise. And silence also functions as a mirror, because when you do not react, others are forced to project their own assumptions onto you, and projection reveals far more than confrontation ever could. Because when someone talks excessively in response to your silence, they are not communicating with you, they are revealing themselves. And the silent samurai knew that listening without interruption was a strategic advantage, because people expose their intentions, their fears, and their emotional weaknesses when they are given space. And silence also dismantles manipulation, because manipulation relies on emotional hooks, guilt triggers, and reactive loops, and without reaction, manipulation collapses, because there is no leverage without emotional access. And this is why manipulators grow uncomfortable around calm, silent individuals, because silence removes the reward they seek, and without reward, the behavior cannot continue. And silence also prevents escalation, because arguments require two participants, conflict requires engagement, and chaos requires reaction. And when you refuse to provide that reaction, the situation either de-escalates or exposes the other person's instability, and either outcome preserves your authority. And many people confuse silence with suppression, but the silent samurai never suppressed emotion, he regulated it, because suppression leaks out uncontrollably, while regulation remains contained, and contained energy is strength. And this is why silence feels heavy at first, because it requires emotional discipline, and discipline always feels heavy before it becomes light. And when you stop speaking impulsively, you become selective, and selectivity increases the weight of your words, because when you speak rarely, people listen carefully, and when you speak constantly, people tune out. And silence also protects your energy, because not every thought deserves expression, not every opinion deserves air, and not every challenge deserves a response. And the more you speak unnecessarily, the more energy you leak into places that do not deserve it. And energy once leaked cannot be reclaimed, which is why silence feels like self-respect to those who understand it, and rejection to those who don't. And this is where most people fail, because when silence triggers discomfort in others, they rush to fix it, explain themselves, soften the moment, and reopen emotional access. And by doing so, they surrender the advantage they accidentally created, because silence only works when you are comfortable being misunderstood temporarily, because misunderstanding is not danger, it is simply the absence of explanation. And those who respect you do not require constant explanation, while those who demand it are often seeking control, not clarity. And the silent samurai never used silence to punish or intimidate. He used it to stay aligned, because silence is a stabilizer. It keeps you centered while others oscillate emotionally. And this is why silence is a weapon, not because it harms others, but because it prevents them from harming you psychologically. And once you understand this, silence stops feeling awkward and starts feeling natural, because you no longer speak to manage perception. You speak only when clarity is required. And when silence becomes your default state, your presence gains weight without effort. And that weight is felt immediately by others, because calm confidence is instinctively recognized, even if it is not consciously understood. And that is the foundation of silent authority. Silence becomes truly powerful only when it is used deliberately rather than reactively, because untrained silence turns into avoidance, emotional withdrawal, or passive aggression. And the silent samurai understood that silence without intention is not strength, it is confusion. And this is why silence must be paired with internal stability, because silence does not hide insecurity, it amplifies it. And if you are silent while internally unstable, people will feel the tension, not the authority, which is why silence must come from grounding, not fear. And grounding comes from knowing that you do not need to be liked, approved of, or understood immediately to remain secure in yourself. And this is where silence separates strong minds from weak ones, because weak minds speak to relieve anxiety, while strong minds tolerate discomfort without reacting. And that tolerance creates psychological dominance, because the person who can remain calm while others seek reaction controls the interaction, not through force, but through restraint. And restraint has always been the mark of mastery, whether in combat, leadership, or social dynamics. And the correct use of silence follows a simple principle. Speak when clarity improves the situation. Remain silent when ego seeks reaction. And most people reverse this. They speak when ego is threatened and stay silent when clarity is needed. And this reversal creates confusion, resentment, and loss of respect. And silence is especially effective in moments of provocation, because provocation is designed to pull you into emotional engagement. And the moment you engage emotionally, you surrender leverage, because emotion clouds judgment, shortens perspective, and narrows options, while silence expands all three. And when you do not react, the provocateur is forced to sit with their own intent, and intent exposed without response often collapses. And silence also teaches people how to treat you, because people adjust behavior based on consequences, not explanations. And when disrespect is met with emotional withdrawal rather than confrontation, the message is delivered without conflict, because access becomes conditional. And conditional access trains respect faster than arguments ever will. And silence also preserves dignity, because words spoken in emotional states are often regretted later, while silence leaves nothing to take back. And the silent samurai never regretted silence, only unnecessary speech. And silence also sharpens perception, because when you are not focused on responding, you are free to observe, and observation reveals patterns, motives, and inconsistencies that words often conceal. And this is why silence makes some people nervous, because they sense they are being seen clearly without being able to influence perception. And perception without control feels threatening to insecure minds. And this is not cruelty, it is clarity. And clarity does not need to announce itself.
And silence should not be used everywhere, because relationships require warmth, trust requires communication, and leadership requires direction. But even here, silence plays a role, because speaking less makes your words more valuable. And when you finally speak, people listen not because you demand attention, but because your silence trained them to. And this balance is the final mastery, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, knowing when silence protects peace and when speech builds connection. And the silent samurai never disappeared from the world. He simply refused unnecessary engagement. And by doing so, he conserved energy, maintained authority, and avoided entanglement in emotional noise. And this is the ultimate purpose of silence, not isolation, not intimidation, but self-possession. Because a person who possesses themselves cannot be provoked, manipulated, or controlled easily. And when you reach this state, silence no longer feels like effort, it feels like home, and your words become precise, intentional, and rare. And rare things are valued instinctively. And once silence is no longer uncomfortable for you, it becomes a test for others, a test they often fail, not because you are superior, but because you are regulated. And regulation is power in a world addicted to reaction. And that is why silence, when used correctly, is not just a weapon, it is armor, clarity, and command combined into one disciplined presence.
Who are still dependent on external feedback, because without reaction, they don't know who they are, and without explanation, they feel invisible, and invisibility feels like danger to the ego. But in reality, invisibility is where power consolidates, because when no one is watching closely, you are free to become something real. And silence also removes social armor, the jokes, the opinions, the emotional expressions people use to signal belonging. And when you stop participating in that exchange, others feel unsettled, not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped mirroring them. And human beings rely heavily on mirroring for comfort, and when that disappears, insecurity surfaces, projection begins, and silence is blamed, interpreted as arrogance, coldness, or distance. And most people react to these projections defensively, trying to correct the narrative. But the silent samurai never corrected perception, because perception is not something you control through words, it is something you influence through consistency over time. And this is where silence becomes the hardest discipline of all, because it requires patience without reassurance, restraint without reward, and calm without confirmation. And it forces you to confront the question most people avoid their entire lives. If no one claps, approves, or understands, will you still continue? And this is why silence is the final test, because it strips away performance and leaves only intention. And those who pass this test stop needing to prove anything. They stop reacting to misinterpretation, and they stop fearing judgment, because they realize that strength does not require consensus, and clarity does not require explanation. And once you understand this, silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling solid, like standing on firm ground while noise collapses around you. Silence builds unbreakable authority because over time it teaches others how to treat you without you having to instruct them, argue with them, or demand respect. And this happens not through intimidation, but through consistency, because silence paired with aligned action creates a psychological weight that words never can. And at first, people test it, filling the quiet with assumptions, projections, and subtle provocations, hoping to pull a reaction out of you, because reaction gives them leverage, clarity, and emotional access. But when no reaction comes, when silence remains calm and steady, something shifts. Confusion replaces confidence, and uncertainty replaces control. Because people are used to negotiating behavior through emotion, and silence removes negotiation entirely. And the silent samurai allowed this process to unfold naturally, never rushing to re-engage, never explaining his restraint, and never justifying his distance, because he understood that authority is not declared, it is observed.
and silence gives people space to observe your consistency without distraction. And over time, the same silence that once triggered discomfort begins to command respect, not because you demanded it, but because reliability signals strength, and strength signals safety. And this is why silence eventually attracts a different quality of interaction: fewer words, more intention; fewer tests, more trust, because people subconsciously recognize that emotional manipulation no longer works and that presence must replace pressure. And this transformation only occurs if silence is maintained without bitterness, without superiority, and without resentment, because resentment leaks need, and need weakens silence. But neutral silence, silence without emotional charge, becomes untouchable. And at this level, you stop monitoring how you are perceived, because perception is unstable and temporary, while character is stable and cumulative. And the silent samurai focused only on character, on alignment between values and behavior, because alignment creates coherence, and coherence creates authority. And authority does not require volume, it requires integrity. And this is why silence eventually feels light, because you stop carrying the burden of being understood, and that freedom unlocks a deeper calm, one that cannot be shaken by criticism or praise, because both lose their influence. And this shift changes how you move through the world: slower speech, fewer words, clearer decisions, and sharper awareness. And people sense this shift immediately, even if they can't explain it, because calm presence is felt before it is analyzed. And this is the completion of the silent samurai path, where discipline no longer feels heavy, consistency no longer feels isolating, and silence no longer feels threatening, because you are no longer waiting for permission to be yourself. And the final realization arrives quietly, that silence was never about withdrawing from the world. It was about withdrawing from noise, from unnecessary reactions, from borrowed opinions, and from emotional dependency. And once that withdrawal is complete, you don't disappear, you stabilize. And stability is what most people unconsciously seek, admire, and follow. Because in a world addicted to noise, the quietest presence often holds the most power. And those who can remain silent without shrinking, without explaining, and without disengaging from their values have already passed the final test, because silence did not weaken them, it revealed who they were all along.
The moment you stop needing people the way you once did, something subtle but undeniable begins to shift in your environment. Because need was never just emotional, it was structural. It was the invisible glue that held certain relationships together. And when that glue dissolves, the structure weakens. And many people mistake this collapse for betrayal, when in reality it is exposure. Because what you are witnessing is not people turning against you, but people losing leverage. And leverage is what many relationships quietly run on. Not connection, not loyalty, not even affection, but emotional access and psychological dependency. And when you become self-respecting, internally anchored, and no longer available for regulation, that access closes. And those who benefited from it feel destabilized, not because you changed into something worse, but because you changed into something independent. And independence removes utility. And when utility disappears, resentment often replaces affection. And this is why self-respect carries a social cost that few talk about. Because as long as you are accommodating, explainable, predictable, and emotionally available on demand, you are easy to integrate, easy to influence, and easy to keep comfortable. But once you stop over-explaining, stop chasing validation, stop softening your boundaries, and stop performing emotional labor for others, the system around you recalibrates, and those who relied on your reactions feel the loss immediately, because you are no longer stabilizing their insecurities, their identity, or their sense of control. And this loss triggers quiet hostility, not always loud confrontation, but subtle withdrawal, misinterpretation, passive aggression, and narrative shifts. Because people rarely say they miss your need, they say you changed. And this accusation is not a moral judgment, it is a grief response, because the version of you that made them feel secure is gone, and the new version no longer negotiates identity through approval. And this is where many people break their own self-respect, rushing to reassure, to explain their growth, to soften their edges, and to make themselves smaller again just to restore harmony. But harmony built on dependency is not peace, it is containment. And the disciplined individual learns to sit through this phase without collapsing back into old patterns, understanding that distance is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is the natural outcome of self-alignment. And the samurai understood that when you stand upright internally, you become harder to lean on, and those who leaned too heavily will stumble. And rather than blaming gravity, they blame the pillar. And this is the phase where self-respect is tested, not through hardship, but through social friction. Because nothing reveals the true foundation of relationships faster than your refusal to overextend yourself. And as you hold this line, the environment begins to show you who was connected to your essence and who was attached to your availability. And this distinction, once seen, cannot be unseen, because you realize that much of what felt like loyalty was actually access, and much of what felt like support was actually regulation. And when that ends, the turning begins. Not because you became cold, but because you stopped being useful in the way they needed. And this is the unspoken price of self-respect, that clarity replaces comfort, and silence replaces negotiation, and standing alone becomes easier than bending again. What most people don't expect is that once the turning begins, it doesn't come with explosions or dramatic endings. It comes quietly, through absence, through changed tone, through conversations that feel slightly off. Because people rarely confront what they cannot control. They retreat, reframe, and rationalize. And the disciplined individual notices this not with bitterness, but with precision, understanding that social ecosystems self-correct. And when you remove yourself as an emotional resource, others must adapt. And adaptation often feels like rejection before it feels like growth. And this is where the difference between ego and self-respect becomes clear, because ego demands acknowledgement, explanation, and closure, while self-respect accepts reality without forcing interpretation. And the samurai never chased closure, because closure is often just another attempt to regain influence. And instead, he observed who adjusted with respect and who withdrew with resentment. And this observation revealed a deeper truth, that healthy connections evolve when need dissolves, while unhealthy ones collapse. And this collapse is not a failure, it is filtration. And filtration is painful only if you are attached to outcomes rather than alignment. And as this filtration completes, something unexpected happens. The emotional noise decreases, the internal clarity sharpens, and a new standard forms, not because you demanded better treatment, but because you stopped tolerating less. And people respond to standards even when they resist them. And over time, the same individuals who quietly turned away either return with a different posture or remain distant permanently. And both outcomes are acceptable, because self-respect is not a negotiation, it is a position. And this position attracts fewer people but higher integrity, fewer conversations but deeper presence, and fewer reactions but stronger boundaries. And this is why self-respect eventually feels peaceful, not lonely, because loneliness comes from abandonment of self, not from separation from others. And the samurai learned that being misunderstood is lighter than being misaligned, and being alone is safer than being consumed. And when you stop needing people to validate your direction, your pace, or your discipline, you gain something far more stable, internal authority. And authority does not beg, explain, or chase, it stands. And those who recognize it approach with respect, while those who depended on your need fade into distance. And this distance is not punishment, it is resolution. Because relationships built on dependency cannot survive self-respect, and relationships built on respect do not require need. And once you fully understand this, the turning no longer hurts, it clarifies, because you realize they didn't turn on you, they simply couldn't follow you where you went, and you no longer needed them to.
After the turning has happened and the distance has settled, a quieter phase begins, one that few people talk about because it lacks drama but carries the most weight. The phase where you stop scanning the room for reactions, stop measuring your growth against who stayed or left, and stop interpreting silence as loss, because by now your nervous system has recalibrated, and what once felt like rejection now feels like space. And space allows observation, and observation reveals patterns that were invisible when you were emotionally involved. And this is where you begin to notice how much energy you used to spend managing other people's comfort, smoothing tensions that were never yours, explaining decisions that didn't require permission, and adjusting your pace to avoid making others feel left behind. And once that energy returns to you, something stabilizes internally, a sense of forward gravity, where movement feels natural rather than forced. And the samurai recognized this phase as the return of center, because when you are no longer pulled by approval or resistance, your actions align effortlessly with your values. And this alignment creates consistency without struggle, because you are no longer splitting attention between self-direction and social maintenance. And the people who remain in your orbit during this phase behave differently. They don't question your boundaries. They don't demand access. They don't require constant reassurance, because respect has replaced dependency. And respect does not need maintenance. It only needs consistency. And this shift feels subtle but profound, because conversations become cleaner, expectations become clearer, and emotional exchanges lose their volatility. And at the same time, you begin to notice the absence of those who thrived on reaction. And this absence no longer creates doubt, because clarity has replaced confusion, and clarity removes the impulse to chase. And the most dangerous mistake here is mistaking this calm for stagnation and attempting to reintroduce noise just to feel movement. But the disciplined individual understands that silence is not emptiness, it is compression, and compression precedes force. And this is where internal authority matures, because you are no longer proving independence, you are living it, and living it quietly is what separates temporary detachment from permanent self-respect. Because true self-respect does not announce itself, it is felt through consistency, through predictability of principles, and through the absence of emotional bargaining. And when you reach this phase, even conflict changes, because you no longer argue to win, you disengage to protect alignment. And disengagement is not avoidance, it is selection, and selection is power. Because you cannot be pulled into dynamics you no longer feed. And this is why the samurai did not fear being alone, because solitude sharpened awareness, and awareness sharpened judgment, and judgment protected direction. And at this stage, direction becomes non-negotiable, not because you are rigid, but because you are clear, and clarity does not bend to accommodate confusion. Eventually, you arrive at the final realization, one that reframes the entire journey, that self-respect was never about distancing from people, it was about removing internal dependency. And once dependency dissolves, relationships reorder themselves naturally, without confrontation, without declarations, without emotional reckoning. And this is where peace becomes durable rather than temporary, because it no longer depends on how others behave, respond, or interpret you. And this independence creates a quiet authority that people sense before they understand, because humans instinctively respond to those who are not seeking extraction, approval, or validation. And this is why over time, new connections form with less friction and more mutual respect, because you are no longer advertising emotional availability as a currency. You are offering presence selectively. And presence given freely is far more powerful than presence given out of need. And at this point, even criticism loses its edge, because criticism relies on leverage, and leverage disappears when identity is internally sourced. And the samurai knew that when no one can move you emotionally, no one can control you strategically.
And this freedom does not make you cold, it makes you precise, because compassion without self-respect leads to depletion, while self-respect without compassion leads to isolation. And the balance emerges naturally once dependency is removed, and what remains is grounded engagement, where you give without draining and receive without clinging. And this balance attracts fewer people but stronger bonds, fewer interactions but deeper meaning. And this is why the turning was necessary, because it removed relationships that required you to stay small, reactive, and explainable, and in their place created room for alignment. And alignment compounds quietly, because you are no longer leaking energy through emotional management, and this reclaimed energy shows up as patience, discipline, and calm confidence. And people mistake this calm for detachment, when in reality it is integration. And once integrated, you stop fearing loss, because nothing essential can be taken from someone who is internally anchored. And the final irony is that those who once turned away sometimes reappear later, not to reclaim closeness, but to test whether access is still available. And the disciplined individual responds not with resentment or invitation, but with neutrality, because neutrality reveals intent faster than confrontation ever could. And by now you understand that you don't need to punish anyone for leaving, because their absence already served its purpose. And the journey ends not with triumph, but with quiet stability, the kind that doesn't need witnesses, because the samurai never measured success by who followed him, only by whether he remained aligned with himself. And once alignment is permanent, nothing external can turn against you again, because you are no longer leaning on anything that can move.